Before I start this video, let me just remind you that I have a new account for all of my anime content and I started up my own comedy channel. With that being said, let's get back to the video. Technocracy, one of the more obscure ideologies. It advocates for decision makers to be selected on the basis of their expertise in a given area of responsibility, particularly with regard to scientific or technical knowledge. Despite being invented in 1919, the ideology didn't receive much popularity until the Great Depression, possibly due to its socialistic solutions. I mean, its initial usage only referred to industrial democracy, being sought to demonstrate the integration of workers into decision-making through existing firms or revolution. But during the Great Depression, the technocracy movement would go on to advocate for a 4-hour workday and a 4-day work week to lower the unemployment rate and to achieve the goal of uninterrupted production, maximizing the efficiency and profitability of resources, transport, and entertainment facilities, avoiding the weekend effect. By tiling the days and work hours of workers, industry and services could be operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Russia would most likely become technocratic under the provisional government. However, the provisional government existed before the technocracy movement did, and could not have survived or continued to industrialize had it surrendered World War I without a revolution. And if you saw my latest video before this one, then you know why. So I'll be using a point of departure that I came up with much earlier than World War I to prepare Russia, not for World War I, but for its surrender under the provisional government. Even though Russia lost the Crimean War, that actually helped Russia because it revealed how far behind it was technologically and caused Russia to start modernizing rapidly. So if Russia simply seized some of the Danubian principalities just a bit over a decade earlier in, say, 1842, causing the Ottoman Empire to declare war on them, and then Britain and France join on the bandwagon, Russia would have lost the Crimean War earlier and would have begun modernization efforts earlier as well. Other than this, all it changes is increasing the likelihood of things that were already highly unlikely happening, like Austria taking Russia's side. How I think the Tsar at the time, Nicholas I, would react and try to prepare Russia for the future is by using the serfs to build banks, railroads, and universities, which the lack of were Russia's biggest bars to industrialization, and what would ultimately cause it to rely on all of that money printing and borrowing that I mentioned in my previous video. Not to mention, with engineering universities, they wouldn't have had to rely on the foreign expertise for anywhere near as long, meaning far less of Russia's oil wells and mines would be owned by foreigners. And last but not least, Nicholas would abolish serfdom around a decade before serfdom was abolished in Russia in our timeline. Russia having a much better economy and a much more modernized army means that they would do much better in the Russo-Japanese War. But I don't think they'd do so well that they'd manage to win. I think they'd do well enough to stop Japan from taking Port Arthur from them completely. So for this video, let's say Japan does well enough to force Russia to share Port Arthur with them. But wait, I've never made maps like this before. This map was made by Patriotic British Mapper. Part 2 of this timeline will be uploaded on his channel. Anyway, back to this video. Having Port Arthur will keep Russia in the game that is World War I for much longer. They would have this timeline's version of the February Revolution in March 1917. They would probably surrender around this much territory to Germany, with a much more manageable debt load, which they could negotiate with the rest of the Entente by possibly selling them subsidized supplies. But there's still no way that Russia could completely pay off its debt by the end of the war. But considering the roaring 20s are just around the corner as the world recovers from World War I, they'll be able to continue paying off their debt and industrializing rapidly without any artificial famines. And Britain and France would be willing to give Russia a bit more time to pay off their debt, considering they would have fought the Germans better than in our timeline, and would have held off for a much longer time than in our timeline. But Russia would still be tiptoeing on eggshells as its economy economy would still lag behind the rest of Europe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the Great Depression, we've got the Greco-Turkish War to tend to, which would go very, very differently from our timeline. Russia is still a nationalistic and religious country in this timeline, so they would support the Greeks in the war, with the Greeks doing better in the war thanks to Russian support going to them instead of Turkey. France and Italy would see the opportunity to realise their claims to territory in Anatolia that they felt entitled to due to the Treaty of Sèvres that was never enforced, and also help Greece out to get a slice of that Turkey, which is now looking quite greasy. No more puns? Okay, I'll just leave those on my comedy channel. Oh yeah, and Russia will get the Armenian claims to Turkey that they were promised at Sèvres too. Moving on to the Great Depression, workers will be very, very unhappy. Russia will look like it did in the days leading up to the Civil War in our timeline. Now, here's my other point of departure. Howard Scott, a leader of the technocracy movement during the Great Depression in the United States, goes to Russia, possibly because he's expelled since America is addicted to capitalism and he believed in things like people being paid in energy certificates, or maybe he moves willingly, seeing it as the opportunity for his committee on technocracy to flourish since the US is too addicted to capitalism or too stable. Whatever the matter, after he arrives in Russia, he might team up with Alexander Bogdanov. The technocrats would most likely take the lead in Russia by a combination of the political leaders realizing that this is likely the most peaceful way to keep some of their power rather than risk a bloody and very destructive civil war against communists, anarchists, and socialist separatists, etc., and how the Kornilov affair was foiled. The term technot refers to the region over which a technocratic society would operate. The region would be used to provide an abundance of goods and services within a sustainable ecological context to its citizens. According to technocrats, a technate cannot simply be set up anywhere like a modern-day country. It needs sufficient natural resources, an existing industrial and scientific base from which to operate the technate, and a sufficient amount of trained personnel for its operation. Now, there was no planned technate for Russia to be a part of in our timeline since it was a part of the USSR during the Great Depression, but I can make parallels or an equivalent to the planned North American technate. That plan included using Canada's rich deposits of minerals and hydroelectric power as a complement to the United States' industrial and agricultural capacity. Since Greece is one of Russia's closest allies and was hit by the Great Depression like a train wreck, it would unify with Russia to form the Eurasian technate. Even though Greece doesn't have much to offer in the way of agriculture, natural resources, or industry, it has the world's largest merchant fleet and ice-free seaports, the lack of which has hindered Russia a lot historically. But anyway, there's parts of Turkey in the way, but Russia and Greece can simply conquer them. As for where else would unify into the Eurasian technate, it's hard for me to imagine the Eurasian technate being as anti-nationalism as the USSR was, or as nationalistic as Imperial Russia was. So I think it won't shy away from using pan-Slavism to get Yugoslavia to unify with it. This would definitely work since Yugoslavia was founded upon the advocacy of pan-Slavism. But the Eurasian technate will have to make some compromises. Greece and Russia were both religious Orthodox Christian states. And in Yugoslavia there was a separation from church and state since most Kosovars and Bosnians are Muslims, Serbians are Orthodox Christians, and Croats, along with Slovenes, are Catholics. But did Yugoslavia really have a separation of church and state? The Serbian Orthodox Church had a lot of influence before the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was established. This continued after that, but since there was a lot of Roman Catholics and, to a lesser extent, Muslims in Yugoslavia, its influence had to be reduced by the state. The Orthodox Church wasn't happy about it, especially after Yugoslavia signed a concordant with the Vatican about the status of the Roman Catholic Church in Yugoslavia, which basically gave it a chance to proselytize in all of Yugoslavia, not just the traditionally Roman Catholic areas. The Serbian Orthodox Church organized protests against this, and it was subsequently dropped. So officially there was a separation between the church and state, but in practice it worked very differently. The Technot would make these compromises since they would want Bosnia-Herzegovina's large tracts of arable land, extensive forests, clean water, manganese, silver, lead, copper, iron ore, and chromium. They'd also want Slovenia's crude steel, bentonite, cement, iron, rivers and lakes, Croatia's calcium, gypsum, natural asphalt, silica and mica, or things both Slovenia and Bosnia-Herzegovina have in abundance like forestry and zinc, or things Slovenia and Croatia have in abundance in common like coal, hydropower or bauxite, and the only thing Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina have a lot of in common, which is salt. After Poland sees how the Eurasian Technot is more secular than Imperial Russia was, albeit at least officially, they'd probably be willing to unify with it. If not, the Technot would just conquer them. I mean, nobody prevented the USSR from conquering Ukraine, since Poland was more rich in natural resources than probably all of Yugoslavia. And after Poland, Czechoslovakia, so that they could get to Germany. Having Germany be a part of the Technot would be the technocrats' dream come true, since it had the largest and most well-educated working class in Europe, on top of being fully industrialized. That's all for part 1, folks. Stay tuned to Patriotic British Mappers channel for part 2.